as the Dean of UCI School of Education, have the opportunity and pleasure of welcoming our guest Tyrone Howard back to UCI for this address. He's going to be introduced shortly by Professor Brandy Gatlin Nash. So we'll hold off on saying all the good, nice things about Tyrone Howard that got him invited to give part of this new series that we've created at UCI School of Education several years ago, the Dean Series on Inclusion and Equity. And Professor Howard is now, I think, about the fifth or so speaker in this series. We've had Pedro Noguera before, Deborah Ball, Carolyn Tyson, Roberto Gonzalez. It's quite, the A-list of academic expertise interested in issues of inclusion and equity and doing such powerful, important work for the field as a whole. And that work, of course, is at the core of the UCI School of Education commitment, equity, and social justice. It's infused all of our work and is a central commitment. And so we're really grateful to folks like Tyrone Howard in the field for coming forward and contributing to our work through sharing his wisdom and insights. Brandy.
Thank you, Dean Aram. I have the distinguished honor to introduce Professor Tyrone Howard today. Professor Tyrone Howard is the Pritzker Family Endowed Chair in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. He is the director of the UCLA Pritzker Center for Strengthening Children and Families and the UCLA Center for the Transformation of Schools. He's the founder and executive director of the UCLA Black Male Institute. Professor Howard's research examines race, culture, and educational equity. He has published several best-selling books and countless peer-reviewed articles exploring these topics. For his substantial accomplishments and contributions to the field of educational research, Professor Howard was named an AERA Fellow in 2018. In 2017, he was listed by Education Week as one of the 60 most influential scholars in the nation in forming educational policy, practice, and reform. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tyrone Howard to the School of Education at UCI.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Gatlin Nash. Thank you, Dean Aram. Thank you, Professor Bustamante. Thank you, Professor Pena. This is always fun to come back and be in the presence of folks who are connected to the place that was so critical, so foundational in my development as a person, as an educator, as a scholar. So I'm always just overjoyed to have the chance to do anything affiliated with UCI. One of the things that I typically don't put in my bio, but I should have, as some of you may know, others may not, I'm also a proud graduate of UC Irvine, 1991. And so, like I said, this place has always had a special place in my heart, and I'm just so impressed and loving to hear, as we were talking before we went live here, some of the tremendous expansion that you all have in the School of Education and bringing on tremendous bright up and coming scholars such as Randy and Andres. It says that my alma mater is in good hands. So I'm pleased to hear that, excited to see where you all are going. So I'm going to share my screen so we can get started, because I'll wax poetic about my time at Irvine far too long, and I don't want to do that. I want to talk about the state of affairs around racial realism. I'm going to try to really weave in the brief time I have with you, kind of the personal and the professional, because the way I come to this work is through my own lived experiences. You know, I frequently tell my doctoral students that research is me search, that we oftentimes engage in work that is personal to us. And I think that's a good thing. I think we should own that. I think we should sort of receive that. And for me, so much of the work I do today, and so much of the work I've done in higher education for the past almost 25 years now, are really rooted in some of the lived experiences I had. And really, when I think about the sort of the intellectual sort of birth, if you will, I come back to UCI. And, you know, I always pull up these old photos of the people and the experiences and the ways in which we engaged in issues around, really, we didn't have the words then around equity and inclusion, but we were fighting for diversity. We were fighting for representation. We were fighting to be seen and heard. I was very sort of, you know, present and very much an active participant in a lot of the student protests that were happening then, very much a key figure in some of the divestiture of South Africa and apartheid movements back then, very much involved in some of the efforts we had around pushing back against police brutality back then, got involved in student orgs, just, I mean, so much of where my awakening and courses and professors and friends and colleagues that I came into contact with really shaped me as a thinker, shaped me as a person. And, you know, I've shared here some of the friends that I was able to meet during that time that I still am in touch with to this day. But also, if I can, like I said, the personal and the professional are always connected. I met a bright, smart young lady when I was at UC Irvine back in 1989. And we started a conversation about a host of different things, her interests, my interests. And I would have never known that that conversation with that young lady that I had some 30 years ago would result in my family. And that is because I met my wife at UCI. She is an alum of UCI as well. We have 4 amazing adult young, I can't call them children anymore, offsprings. And again, this all comes back to my grounding and my sort of my place at UCI. So like I said, this place for me has not only professional sort of ties to my life, but also personal ones as well. And so, and I must mention my youngest son is also, like his mom and dad, an alum of UCI. So UCI runs through our blood literally in so many ways. And so I just had to start start my conversation off with those sort of pieces of sort of the personal to kind of help ground and shape the awareness that I have from folks like Professor Thomas Parham, the late Dr. Erling Piper Mandy, Dr. Horace Mitchell, Cheryl Dearman, Michael Scott. I mean, the fact that I still remember these names some 3 decades later shows you the kind of profound impact that they had on me in terms of just asking hard questions. And so I think we have to ask hard questions. And I've always tried to ask hard questions in light of the work I do as an educator. And needless to say, we are facing some really challenging times now. And I think as we are facing challenging times, we have to ask some hard questions. And I think those hard questions are not necessarily new questions, but I think the hard questions are important because we've not really answered those questions in ways that speak to our current reality. So as I kind of start my conversation with you today, I want to sort of bring you to one of my favorite essayists who I first read when I was at UC Irvine, James Baldwin. And one of the favorite essays of mine that Baldwin writes is this talk called A Talk to Teachers. And he writes this talk in 1963. And when Baldwin writes this essay, he's writing to educators at a time when there is deep-seated inequality. He's writing this essay at a time when there is deep-seated poverty, there's racial strife, there's a push for civil rights. And there's a lot happening in America in 1963 as Baldwin writes this essay. But what's important to note is if you read Baldwin's essay in 1963, you would almost feel as if someone were writing the same essay in 2020 because there's so many parallels between what Baldwin had written about then and what we see in our current moment today. But what I so appreciate about this talk to teachers that Baldwin writes is that basically he's sort of really laying the gauntlet down to educators and says that teachers have a role and a responsibility in that current moment, much in the way that I think that teachers have a role and a responsibility in this current moment. And he starts his essay out by saying, let's begin by saying that we're living through dangerous times. Everyone in this room is in one way or another aware of that. And just those 2 sentences, I think, so adequately capture our current moment. You know, we are living in dangerous times. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. Everyone is aware of this. And part of what Baldwin said to teachers over 50 years ago is much in the way that I want to say, what I want to say to educators today. And what Baldwin says to teachers that if you're going to do this work right, you must be prepared to, in his words, quote unquote, go for broke. you must be prepared to go for broke. And what Baldwin talks about is that there really is no middle ground. There's no neutral stance. That at the end of the day, you're either part of perpetuating the same systems of oppression that have excluded lots of children and families for generations, or you play a role of helping to dismantle and to disrupt and to rethink these systems so that we can create a different world in a different way for our young people. And so Baldwin makes the claim that I think is so eloquently articulated, and one that I think we have to really apply today in our current context, is that for teachers, for educators, for policymakers, for leaders, no matter what your role is in education, there is no middle ground. There is no straddling of the fence. You've got to take a clear political stance to say, I'm going to either help perpetuate current structures and systems or really push the envelope and be willing to be labeled as a troublemaker. Bayard Rustin, one of my favorite civil rights arguments, said what we need are a community of angelic troublemakers. You have to be willing to be an angelic troublemaker, to disrupt, to challenge, to question, to upset. And for many of you who are part of this, you were probably already labeled as that person, as the agitator, as a disruptor, as the person who always brings up issues of race or issues of gender identity inclusion, or bringing up the concerns of queer folks, or bringing up the folks who are undocumented. And if you are the person who gets labeled that and you are seen as the troublemaker, then you are doing the kind of disruption that I think is so desperately needed in these times. So instead of sort of trying to shed that label, my ask of you would be to embrace that label, is to be honored by that label, is to sort of wear that label and wear it with pride, because that's how systems are ultimately going to change, by having bold, courageous individuals who are willing to upset the status quo, say the unspeakable, think the unthinkable, and do what some would consider to be the undoable. And that's whether you're a researcher, a scholar, a practitioner, a school leader, a counselor, a community advocate, a community member, a parent. It doesn't matter the role, there is a role to play. So in this moment, as we think about dangerous times, I think about Baldwin's notion of, are we prepared to go for broke? That we are living through dangerous times. And I think in the current moment, the fact that we are combating what I refer to as this double tsunami. And you all know, in all likelihood, what tsunamis do. Tsunamis are destructive, they're disruptive, they can desecrate an entire sense of normalcy. There's a reason why we're having this meeting in this format, because this is what we have now become accustomed to, because tsunamis upset your sense of normalcy, transform your way of communicating, will offset your ways of convening. And so we have to understand what this moment means in terms of this double tsunami. And as you think about this double tsunami, you know, the first part of the tsunami is obviously the COVID-19 pandemic. When we begin to understand and unpack the ways that this pandemic has had a huge impact on all of us, let us be clear that while we recognize it has had an impact on all of us, it has not impacted all of us in the same way. Okay, I want to be clear about that. It has had an impact on all of us, but we have not all been impacted in the same way. And this is where issues around racial realities come to fruition, because there's been a mound of data that has looked at the ways in which this pandemic has had a really deeply damaging impact on Black and Brown communities. The fact that data has been coming out for some time showing that Black and Brown communities were being hit harder, higher rates of infection, disproportionate amounts of death. You've all seen that data. Even as we look at the data within the context of schools, we have seen that Black and Brown children are the ones who, at the beginning of the pandemic, were less likely to have access to devices, less likely to have access to high-speed internet, more likely to have caregivers who were essential workers. The US Department of Education put out a report about 2 weeks ago that shows that we are still not able to find about 3 million students across the country who have not logged on, who have not been found, who we're just not aware of since March 15th, when most schools across the country shut down. So there's 3 million students, we just don't know where they are. And the data reports that we know that these students who are missing are disproportionately likely to be Black, Brown, and poor. So we need to understand that as we start to understand the devastation that this pandemic has caused, that a one-size-fits-all approach to how we come out of it is not going to work. That unless we're asking some hard questions, unless we're asking some uncomfortable questions about what this has meant for Black, Brown, poor students, then we're going to ultimately sort of refer back to how things were beforehand. See, what I would argue is that in education, we rarely get opportunity to have a reset of how schools operate. We rarely have the opportunity to have a redo, to be able to reimagine and to rethink and reconceptualize how schools can work. And in many ways, what this pandemic has done, if there's any, and I do mean any small sliver of a silver lining, it's given us an opportunity to rethink the way we do schools. Let's be clear, there's a mound of research that tells us that our students are better off in schools. And to a large degree, I would not disagree with that. But let's also talk about the reality that schools as they were currently set up were not serving all students well. And that there's an increasing amount of research that's coming out that's showing that for some students, this remote thing is working for them actually. For some students, this has been a way to not have to deal with issues of anxiety in school, bullying in school, social isolation, exclusion in school, microaggressions from adults in school. So part of what we must do is, as we think about moving back into whatever schools will look like, and folks in Orange County, you all will probably see it beforehand because you all have a different way of how you operate under this pandemic. But it gives us an opportunity to rethink and reimagine schools. And I think if we're going to do that, what we have to do is be very intentional and very unapologetic and very laser focused on sort of the racial realities. You know, the data has been telling us for some period of time, again, that our data has to be racially conscious. Our data has to look at what the impacts have been on BIPOC youth. It has to be clear to say that, again, while we're all affected by this pandemic, we're not all affected in the same way. And so we have to begin to understand what is it that helps us to get at the heart of the matter of why we continuously see Black, Indigenous, Pacific Islander, Latinx folks who consistently are the groups who are suffering at greater rates, excluded at higher rates. And that is sort of where this racial realism has to ask some hard questions about, you know, what is it about sort of life in America that has consistently made it more challenging, more difficult, and provided more obstacles to be overcome by certain populations compared to others. And that's the conversation that we say we want to have. And I oftentimes question if we're really serious about having those conversations. And even if we are comfortable with having those conversations, to me, the next step becomes, how do we move from conversations to real action and structural movement and sort of dismantling policies that exist in institutions of higher education where we still see Black and brown folks, for example, are not being tenured at the same rates as their white counterparts, or the Black and brown tax that we know that we see folks take on in institutions of higher education that our white peers and colleagues are not asked to take on, or the ways in which we have to explain how our work, if you do race-specific work, is definitely as rigorous and as thoughtful as folks who don't do that work. Or how is it that we are in this moment now, higher ed folks, where we're saying we want folks to put a diversity statement in their applications, where some of us have done diversity works for our entire lives. Our entire sort of body of work has been around issues around diversity. So that's just within the higher ed context. We have to begin to ask ourselves questions about how we provide upward mobility and how we rethink policies and procedures at the higher education level. But this is also at the K-12 level of how we consistently see the ways in which we disproportionately exclude, suspend, expel Black and brown youth at rates that are just not acceptable. And you all have it right there in Orange County, where several districts that we've looked at, it's just woefully borderline criminal, the rates at which, even in the virtual space, that we are disciplining Black and brown youth, creating a pathway to prisons. So I want us to be mindful of how we ask these questions, of the fact that we look at across this country, there's some clear mortality rates that are harming folks of color in ways that they're not harming other populations. And so what I've been asking educators that I've talked to them is that as you sort of continue to engage with young people in the virtual space, is to realize in this moment that there are students who are still reeling from significant loss of loved ones, of family members, of friends. There are young people who are still full of anxiety because they're worried about their caregivers who might be essential workers who don't have the luxury of staying home. But I also want us to make sure as we engage in this work, we also see the uncanny and the ongoing resilience that lots of caregivers demonstrate in this moment. As this photo demonstrates, I'm sure many of you have seen it. a young mother who has to work to provide for her family, but still wants to ensure to the fact that her children are able to get access to internet, because in many of our communities, oh, by the way, which happen to be poor, Black, and brown, internet accessibility still remains to be a big, big challenge. So even as we have this conversation, part of what I want us to recognize is the determination and the resourcefulness that many families show and demonstrate on an ongoing basis. I use the term resilience, and that's a commonly used phrase, I should say, that comes about a lot. But part of what I've been trying to push back on, and Rich Milner talks about this, and Venus Evans Winters talks about, when can we get rid of the word resilience? I mean, resilience only has to be manifested or shown or demonstrated in the face of adversity. Is that our goal should be to imagine a world where people don't have to have resilience to have their basic needs met. So Milner talks about the fact that resilience is a word that we should just eliminate from our lexicon, because as long as we have to manifest resilience, that means that, you know, we still have racism that's in place. We still have sexism is in place. We still have xenophobia we're fighting. We still have transphobia. We still have homophobia. We still have, you know, ableism. As long as we have these systems of oppression, patriarchy, capitalism that are sort of entrenched in our way of life as folks in this country, then resilience, those of us who have to figure out how to manage, adjust, live, and try to cope, we're always going to say, well, we admire the resilience. And so the goal is, instead of highlighting the resilience, how do we begin to sort of manifest our efforts in dismantling the structures and systems that play themselves out? So as young people in this moment continue to be as brilliant and as resourceful as we have always been in the face of living life in these American states through a racial prism, I am concerned because as we are talking about the learning loss that is being suffered from many young people, as we should, I think what we are also losing sight of is a larger reality that requires our time and attention, and that is the mental health effects of coronavirus on young people. And I raise that because part of what we are needing to do, in my humble opinion, and part of what, as I'm spending more time with schools, is to really begin to create spaces for understanding what young people are feeling in this moment, to give them permission to feel, to talk about feeling, to express how they're feeling, to write about how they're feeling, because this moment is really heavy for all of us, but it doesn't affect all of us in the same way. I want to have us to begin to think about how we need to destigmatize mental health. We need to start talking about mental health, recognizing the importance of mental health. I think the conversation around mental health needs to also take a different shape and form in communities of color, because historically speaking, many communities of color have not really engaged in the same kinds of conversations around mental health, because that has oftentimes been even more of a stigma, more of a taboo topic. But I think this moment is really going to necessitate that we have hard conversations, that we begin to talk about the fact that as we look at data from the Center for the Disease Control that talks about the levels of social isolation that students are suffering from, the increased levels of anxiety that students are suffering from, the increased levels of depression that our students are suffering from, we cannot come back to schools as usual and not provide the adequate supports to ensure that our children are well, that our children are whole, that our children are healthy. It pains me to no end when I talk to school districts across this country, and I do a lot of work in Los Angeles Unified School District. There's close to 600,000 students in that district, but they have approximately 300 social workers in the district. Not all schools have counselors, and when I say counselors, I'm not talking about counselors who deal with courses. I'm talking about counselors who deal with mental health, emotional realities that children have. So how do we think about trying to get kids to be whole when we don't put mental health issues first? I've oftentimes said our goal should be to make sure we're putting Maslow before we put Bloom. Maslow before Bloom, because we all know, and this is what Maslow told us, if basic needs are not met, we are going to not be able to reach the higher academic goals that we set for our students. And I raise that because what we're seeing now is a very tragic set of data coming from, again, from the Center of Disease Control and the World Health Organization, looking at the number of young people, school-age youth, who have either A, had increasing suicidal ideation, or who have even sadly committed suicide during this pandemic. So this is where we must have a significant shift to start having conversations, to be able to recognize that when you look at some of the groups who have had significant spikes in youth suicide over the past 9 months, they've been Black youth, brown youth, LGBTQ youth, and our young boys. And when you begin to unpack the ways in which society has sort of has constructed this way in which these young people attempt to have their humanity seen, heard, and affirmed, it makes more sense to understand why we've seen spikes in those groups. Toxic masculinity that tells young boys that they cannot feel, that they cannot hurt, they cannot express themselves in ways that they need to, contributes to this issue. The pervasiveness of transphobia, homophobia leads to the increasing number of our queer youth who have committed suicide. The fact that Black and brown youth continue to be sort of pathologized in sort of our lexicon and our practice and our policies explains why we see Black and brown youth having spikes in suicide. So I raise these issues to say there's a big moment, a big need, a necessity at this moment to engage in some real hard conversation around mental health and how we respond in a culturally competent, culturally thoughtful manner, how we begin to sort of name the fact that it's okay to not be okay. I mean, hell, if I'm being honest, I mean, for many of us as adults, those of us who have most of our basic needs met, we have had moments over the past 9 months where this has felt heavy, this has felt tiring, this has felt depressing at times. And so if we have felt that, we can only imagine for those families and those youth who are experiencing, housing insecurities, food insecurities, not having adequate access to adult supports during this pandemic. So I just raise this because this is tsunami number one, is to understand some of the mental health effects before we jump into the academic part of this reality. I want to move to the second tsunami, and that was the spring and summer racial unrest, because I think this is the other issue that warrants our time and our attention. And for me, my work has always been about racial justice, racial equity, racial recognition. And this spring and summer sort of put the issue of racism sort of front and center on the sort of the mainstream spotlight again with the unfortunate murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. And in that moment, we saw a significant surge of people who were chanting, marching for Black Lives to Matter. Corporations put out snazzy little ads and said, we're committed to doing this work. Surveys that came out from the Pew Research poll show that 3/4 of Americans believe that systemic racism was real, only to find out that 3 months later, that number had almost been cut in half. So again, we get caught in the moment, but we don't sustain our efforts as a nation. It's typically the folks who are the targets of racial discrimination, the targets of racial oppression, who are the ones who constantly have to raise the issue and keep these issues in the spotlight. But I want us to understand that as we continue to have these discussions, that we cannot move to these sort of neoliberal colorblind moments that I hear oftentimes being sort of promoted so frequently in schools of education, colleges of education across this country. We cannot have these moments where folks sort of move us to say, let's be post-racial, let's begin to recognize that we don't have to talk about race, because the more we say that we are not willing to talk about race, the more we contribute to racial oppression and exclusion. And so what I've been using as a way to kind of help folks as I talk to lots of school leaders across the country who are just not comfortable wanting to have this conversation and don't understand the need for why we have to have this conversation. I've been borrowing from the work of Danny Solorzano and Lindsay Perez-Huber, who talk about the fact that when you begin to look at just the overall history of racism in the US, and Solorzano and Perez-Huber provide a phenomenal visual representation of an abridged history of racism in the United States that I think helps to sort of anchor why this is important. Because when folks say, why, do we still need to, is it quite necessary? And I would say, absolutely it is. Because if you begin to understand our history in these United States of America, just dating back to 1619 to 2020, right? The 401 years where we've seen the decimation of indigenous populations, the destruction of indigenous culture, the destruction of indigenous lands and ways of life, Then we saw 246 years of legal enslavement to folks of African descent. Then we saw 100 years from 1865 to 1965 of Jim Crow, where Jim Crow was centered around segregated schooling, segregated housing, this whole idea of separate but equal, the pervasiveness of voter suppression, the pervasiveness of KKK and racist ideology, where Jim Crow was the way of the land in these United States of America, where young children could not go to schools in their particular neighborhoods, but they had to go to schools that were sort of outlined by busing, where we saw, as I mentioned, voter suppression being sort of rooted in the idea that there were poll tax and grandfather clause and jelly bean tests that folks had to pass in order to be able to just have the right to vote, economic exclusion from various folks of color. So for 100 years, we had Jim Crow. And then even from 1965 to 2020, there's been 55 years of what one might consider what Perez, Huber, and Solorzano refer to as the new Jim Crow, where ongoing efforts of voter suppression still exist in this country, even as recent as 2020. Stacey Abrams' works talks about that, where even issues around economic exploitation and exclusion still is rampant when you begin to understand the ways in which Black and Brown and Indigenous communities still don't have access to the kinds of wealth and job and economic opportunities as other groups do. So the bottom line is only in the last 13% of the last 400 years have we seen any efforts to somehow even come to grips with where we are around issues around racial realities. So this is why we talk about race. This is why racial sort of examinations are important. This is why racial justice is still an elusive sort of reality. And this is why we cannot shy away from these topics, because as we look at our structures and systems and schools and policies across the country, there's still different realities that we all come to grips with that are not in place. So that's why I asked some of my aspiring graduate students, aspiring or current doctoral students, as you look at certain kinds of data that comes out, that we must begin to sort of look at that data with a bit of a critical eye. So recently, someone shared data with me around graduation rates here in our state of California. And as this data was shared, oftentimes what happens is that we look at the discrepancies, which we know have been in place for a very long time in the state of California, we know that. But we also have to be mindful that as we look at these data, that as you begin to make sense out of the data, that we don't reinforce these deficit narratives. So when you look at these outcomes for Black and Brown youth, that we're not quick to jump on this narrative that says or suggests that, well, it's because those parents don't value education as much, or those students are not as motivated as much. Or dare we use Angela Duckworth's framing of grit, where these students are just not committed to demonstrating grit to the same degree. And that's, to me, the notion of grit has been a 21st century form of racism. I know she's tried to clean it up, but it still has been adopted, co-opted based on her own framing that sort of puts poor people and people of color in this ideology that somehow they don't perform as well because they lack the grit. It is Ruby Payne 2.0, Ruby Payne circa 2021 in many ways. So the idea that as we look at these data, let's begin to ask the question about not as what is wrong with this with the young people in these situations, but what is wrong with the structures that serve them? What is wrong with the structures that are supposed to care about them? What is wrong with the structures that are supposed to love them? And how do those structures sort of rethink their pedagogy or rethink their ideology in ways that we don't continue to look at the same data and sort of we look at these data as an indictment of young people. So as we begin to have these conversations, there's been a discussion around how do we become more anti-racist in our approach. And a number of folks have written about this, and Ibram Kendi has been someone who's kind of put out this sort of framing of how we think about anti-racism. And so part of what I've been saying and suggesting is that there are some ways we can begin to become more anti-racist in our classrooms and in our curriculum. And this goes for not only K-12 schools. I think this is also relevant for institutions of higher education. Too many graduate students, undergraduate students still lament the fact that they don't see many folks of color that they are reading in the curriculum. They're not reading works that are tied to the experiences of oppressed peoples, minoritized populations. that we don't have enough of a focus on how we challenge whiteness as an ideology, how we don't challenge white supremacy as an overarching framework that still guides and informs much of our own thinking as a country, our policies as a nation, school practices, school policies, how we begin to challenge notions of whiteness in ways that begin to upset the ways that have oftentimes been seen. How we begin to really have hard conversations about not punishing difference. And I raise that because, again, one of the areas that my research has looked at for the last 10 years is school discipline, and the way in which school discipline continues to be highly racialized. And I would say also has a gender component. Two of my former doctoral students, Bianca Otto did a phenomenal work looking at the ways in which Latinx girls are oftentimes policed and surveilled in high schools, and oftentimes in the subjects of gendered violence, all by way of school resource officers. And she makes a beautiful call to get rid of school resource officers because they do nothing but oftentimes interrogate and agitate Black and brown young women. Jamelia Harris talks about the fact that in her phenomenal dissertation, the ways in which Black girls are oftentimes sort of, again, criminalized, scrutinized in ways that no other group of young people are in school. So this idea of how we have to move away from school discipline and move towards more restorative approaches, and that's the goal. How do we begin to think about different ways of including redemption, of recognizing that students who are going through this moment of pandemic are going to come back to school still hurt, still not whole. And if we as school personnel can't respond to that in any kind of a caring, loving way, we'll see an even greater spike in the number of young people who are going to be labeled again as disruptive and problematic. And then the whole discussion of Black Lives Matter. I think there's a larger conversation there. I continue to hear from school personnel who say, don't want to touch Black Lives Matter. Can't touch Black Lives Matter. The district has put out a mandate to say that we don't talk politics. Well, that is always intriguing to me. How do we not talk politics when we've been talking election? That's politics. We talk about things such as the environment. That's politics. We're even at a point now when we talk masks, and that's become political. So everything we do in the curriculum is political, but for some reason, Black Lives Matter has become off topic for some districts. So I maintain that if we're going to really be willing to do this work right, becoming anti-racism focused in our work is a step in the right direction. But I say that in many ways, it's not enough. I think we have to go even further and begin to think about addressing anti-Black racism, because as we do more research and we collect data from students across schools nationwide, Black students still talk about the ways in which they experience something different than any other group of students. And a lot of the data would bear this out. Acts of aggression, acts of hostility, exclusion for just being yourself, how Black children are labeled as being louder, Black children are labeled as being more aggressive, Black children are labeled as being more defiant, all these terms that we use that are steeped in anti-Black racism. And I maintain that it doesn't only happen within the context of K-12 schools, it's also rampant in institutions of higher education as well, where there are different kinds of obstacles we put in the way for Black academics. Oftentimes Black staff are overlooked. Frequently, the fact that, Black students say, where are the Black people? Where are the Black students? Where are the Black faculty? I think there's a larger conversation we must have around how anti-Black racism manifests itself. And to be clear, anti-Black racism also cuts across other groups of color too, and within. And that's a much larger conversation that we can have, or we can address that with some Q&A. But this idea that sort of is informed by a larger white supremacy framing that kind of talks about Blackness being synonymous with crime, lack of hard work, pathology, low intelligence, that unfortunately still is quite prevalent in too many of our schools and too many of our institutions of higher education. And again, I come back to Kendi Ibram's work, where he talks about the question that we all should be asking, and this is what I've been engaging many of my pre-service teachers around, is this idea of who are you, right? And are you racist? Are you anti-racist? And what Kendi talks about is the fact that it's not enough to say I'm not racist, but that the place we want to be is that I'm anti-racist, because to say I'm not racist is to say basically I'm kind of neutral. I'm kind of, I'm kind of middle of the road. Where if you're neutral, you're complicit. If you're middle of the road, then you are a participant. And part of what the goal is to move toward becoming more anti-racist and to move away from this left side of the framing, where Kendi talks about the fact that, there are folks who are segregationists who say things like, these students cannot be helped. Their families don't have fill in the blank. There's more punitive approaches. There's this ideal that these students, be they Black, brown, poor, are permanently inferior. Or there's the assimilationist approach that is kind of tied to this idea that these students are temporarily inferior, that they can be helped, but they must do what I ask them to do, what I need them to do. It's all conditional based on what I, as the educator, need or want or must have. And the goal is to ultimately move to this final point where we're more anti-racist, or Bettina Love referred to this as being more abolitionist in our approach, where we recognize that these people are people and they deserve to be treated as such, and that they're already inherently civilized, and that they're already inherently valuable. And our goal should be to take a closer look at our policies and practices and procedures that continue to push Black and brown children out. I raised that because as we looked at data from the U.S. Department of Education that looked at school discipline, let me be clear about this point. I keep coming back to school discipline, that the primary reasons why we suspend students in this school are because of acts of insubordination, defiance, disrespect. Now, those are highly subjective categories. And what disrespect looks like in one person's eyes is something very different than the next person's eyes. Because a kid walks in and he has a hoodie on his head, or they have a hoodie on their head, it's not a sign of insubordination. But what we see over and over again is that as you look at these subjective categories of insubordination, disrespect, and defiance, that Black and brown and poor children are more likely to be targeted in those areas. So the goal here is to make sure that if we're going to be anti-racist, that we're focused on reducing these inequalities and reducing and eliminating these practices that only reinforce the kind of racist structures that push Black and brown children out or label them as being problematic. And so the goal here is to never see them as inferior, is to always see their potential and always see the best and brightest in them. So I want to be clear about that. Let me move into one final slide and then I want to leave us open some time for some Q&A, because I think the question becomes, how do we start moving towards a better space and better place? What do we do? And just some of the ways in which we've been talking about with my work with the Center for the Transformation of Schools and the UCLA Pritzker Center is that we need to engage in ongoing intense training, professional development, professional learning for all of us, for the folks in higher education. Sometimes we need it more than the folks in K-12, if you ask me, around the historical impact of racism. We need to have training happening in K-12 schools with teachers, with counselors, with administrators. We just have to have this ongoing sort of dialogue, discussion, training, intervention on how we help folks understand the legacy that unfortunately is racism in our country. I think the second thing we have to start doing is beginning to engage in community needs assessment. For far too long, communities of color have oftentimes been seen as places of exploration, sites of excavation. Researchers come in and kind of tell them what they need to do, what they should have. And I think we've got to make sure we don't engage in that kind of sort of paternalistic kind of sort of relationship with communities. I think we have to come in and learn from communities and talk to students and hear from caregivers and hear from folks who have been in communities 2-3 decades about how education can be better, how we can rethink schools, how we can rethink the way that we have after school programs, how we can reimagine supports for our students. We have to make sure that we anchor the voices, the perspectives, and the viewpoints of those who are most impacted by our efforts at the center of the conversation. I think we must have cross-system training. I think for far too long, what we do in this country, we fall subject to these silos. The educators only talk to the educators. The social workers only talk to the social workers. The legal experts only talk to the legal experts. The bottom line is we will do better when we can bring together cross-system training. Part of what needs to happen is that the social worker needs to sit down with the teacher. The teacher needs to hear from the medical expert. The medical expert and the social worker can really learn from the legal expert. We have to rethink the ways in which we come together to understand this work, because oftentimes we're doing the work with the same population, but we're asking different questions, we're using different models, we're using different literacies, we're using different kinds of methods. And I'm saying that there is some value to bringing together a cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary approach to how we think about this work. We need to begin to look at, again, I keep coming back to this, our anti-racist policies, procedures, and ideas. We should be doing internal audits. We should be doing climate assessments. All of our departments, I mean, we did one in our department about, what, 4 years ago? No, about 3 years ago. It was not pretty because we heard from students and staff about where we fall short. Sometimes we don't want to engage in the audits of the climate assessment because we're afraid to hear what might come back. We need to be open to hear what may come back because that's what will make us better. Will it hurt? Yes. Will it sting? Yes. But will it give us some real data points to help us move forward? Certainly. And then we have to do some real review of policies and procedures on how they impact students of color. That's higher ed, that's K-12. Too many of our students of color in our graduate programs say that they still feel marginalized. They're still subject to widespread microaggressions. They still feel like they don't get supported financially or intellectually. We hear the same thing in our K-12 schools. We've got a project we're launching right now. Some of our pilot data told us that, again, that Black students, brown students oftentimes are subject to all kinds of mistreatment at the hands of adults. Even in the virtual space, we're seeing that as well. So here are some just musings, thoughts, ideas of where my work is going to see how we transform systems, how we change policies, how we affect procedures, so that we don't continue to sort of come back to schools in the same way that they were before, but we come back to schools wanting to think sort of holistically about the well-being of young people, sort of centering mental health as a real important issue, but also centering issues around race and racism as equally as important as well. And as I close, I think about Derek Bell, who talked about racial realism, and he makes a much more pessimistic assessment of where we are as a country, where he thought that Black people will never gain full equality in this country. But he says that we must acknowledge and move to adopt policies based on what he calls racial realism, to recognize these peaks of progress, and that the acknowledgement enables us to avoid despair, frees us to imagine and implement racial strategies that can bring fulfillment and even triumphs. So I'll stop there. I want to say thank you for your presence. Thank you for being here. And I want to leave a little bit of time so we can ask some questions. I feel like I covered a lot of territory in a short period of time. I'm sure I probably, hopefully, stoked some curiosity, some disagreements, some queries. And so if that's okay with the organizers, I'll stop my share here and open up to some Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you for that extremely thought-provoking talk. And we already have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I also see a hand raised. So yeah, let's get right into it. I'll start with the first question in the Q&A, which is from Hui. And he says, just as we're discouraged to look at student populations of Asian students in pan-ethnic ways, do you think we can disaggregate data with Black and Latino students populations to find certain populations who are performing just as well as their white peers and learn from what contributes to their success?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been pushing not only the California Department of Education, but also the U.S. Department of Education for years to do a more granular analysis around disaggregating different ethnic and racial groups, because we tend to use these large umbrella terms that don't quite capture the history, the culture, the perspectives, and the experiences of different subgroups. And I think the Asian American population is a phenomenal example of that, right? Where when you begin to look at the experiences and just the historical experiences of, let's say, East Asian groups compared to, say, Southeast Asian groups, they're very different. And the experiences here in these United States are very different. And I think you could do the same thing for Latinx populations as well as Black population, because we got Black folks who are US born. We got Black folks who are from the different countries in Africa, Black folks who are from the Caribbean. Those are all different cultural nuances, languages, histories. And so as we start to think about how we respond and how we react, a one-size-fits-all approach is oftentimes not the approach that we want to use.
Excellent. Okay, so our next question is from Anthony. And he says, I don't see color as one of the hardest things to hear from a person or a leader. Moving to a virtual landscape, is it better that we physically can't see the color of others in the room? How can we challenge racial norms without physically seeing color because we are virtual right now?
Yeah, no, so on this one, even there's a larger sort of commentary I have around the virtual situation, remote learning, around just the idea of kids being required to have cameras on or off. But it's not really because of racial circumstances. It's more tied to the fact that when it's tied to just invasion of privacy and space. And that's another conversation I can come back to later. But as it pertains to sort of the issue around colorblindness, look, folks, we live in one of the most racially diverse states in the entire country and one of the most diverse regions, Southern California, in the entire world. For us not to see and not to recognize racial and ethnic diversity, I think is a huge, huge slap in the face of folks of color, because it essentially says your identity or a core part of your identity doesn't matter. I don't want to see it. I don't want to acknowledge it. I don't want to recognize the day-to-day challenges, the day-to-day struggles that you have by the skin that you wear, right? And the skin that does not go away. And so to deny that, to not see that, to ignore that is a huge indictment to say, let's kind of assume that issues around racism no longer exist. It operates from the standpoint, let's assume that issues of colonialism didn't exist. Let's assume that issues around slavery did not exist. And so to do that is an attempt to erase an entire history, struggle, death, destruction of a people, of peoples, I should say. And so, yeah, we must recognize it. And I think even if we move into the Zoom space of saying, let's not have cameras on, that's still an attempt to somehow not see race. And I think we have to embrace it and we need to talk about it, listen and learn from it.
Great. Okay, our next question is from Jacob. And he wants to know what questions would you use to guide students in discussion of Black Lives Matter movement? I could see an approach of "do you agree" as problematic and entrenching students in their current views. How do you approach it differently, and what understanding do you think students can reasonably work to?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think, and I'm working right now. It's interesting. I had a high school teacher, history teacher, who reached out to me, and she's in a very affluent, mostly white school district. And she said, my students are kind of struggling with the whole Black Lives Matter movement. And she told me there was a very conservative community. And she said, and I don't feel equipped to have the conversation. Could you come in and talk? And I did. And I've been coming to the class now for the last, 6 or 7 weeks. I come in once a week. And I started the conversation by saying, why do you think there is a need for a group of people to even come up with a phrase, Black Lives Matter? What do you think the origin of it is, right? Well, I mean, I don't think, Elise Garza and Patrice Cullors and the other folks just decided one morning, let's come up with this phrase or saying called Black Lives Matter. So we started there around why the need and what were the events that had precipitated the movement and why those events were troublesome, because they were reflective of a larger trend of what was happening to Black people in their interaction with the police. Innocent Black people dying at the hands of police. Police officers not being punished or being even charged with the murders of unarmed Black people. So we started there about why there was a need to put value on Black life. And so needless to say, there were some students who pushed back, who didn't see it that way. But part of what I tried to help them to recognize that your reality in a world that is very devoid of these circumstances is part and parcel of the challenge here. I need you to sort of take off the blinders, and we all have them. Take off blinders and say, let me put you in a situation where if someone said that the kids in Palos Verdes are going to be sort of seen and looked at and talked about in a particular way, and they're going to be targeted, and you might even be killed. If it affected you in the way that it affects Black people, you would say Palos Verdes students' lives matter, right? So part of what I have to do is kind of make the conversation around Black Lives Matter around why does it exist in the first place? And even attempts to say, and this is another conversation we got into, well, don't all lives matter? So we got into the whole all lives matter discussion, but I would say, yeah, well, all lives cannot matter until Black lives matter. Or I've said nowhere in there does it say only Black lives matter. Nowhere in there does it say Black lives matter more. But I also think it speaks to the way that in this country, whenever there's an attempt to somehow center, anchor, give credence, recognition, respect to Black people, Black lives, it oftentimes feels as a threat to people who don't see it that way. And that's just a larger conversation. But I appreciate that question.
Yeah, thank you. So let's see here. I know, I believe I saw a hand from Sergio, but I don't think actually because of our format that I can have him speak. So I don't know if Sergio, you want to write in the chat or a question in the Q&A. And actually looking at the time, I think we have only about 2 minutes because Dr. Howard does have some meetings to get to. So I'm just gonna scroll down the questions. You know what, I really like a question here from Kikai. Sorry, hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Maybe to end us on a positive note, do you have any words of motivation to keep us going? Sometimes in our online meetings, when I bring up something that affects Black or Indigenous communities, I can literally see side eyes in our meetings. Sometimes it drags me down, feeling like I'm bugging the whole group. Yeah, please.
Keep bugging. Keep bugging. That's my ask of us. And I know there is a fatigue factor that happens for those of us who fight for racial justice. I get that because that's part of what this work entails. But keep bugging, keep challenging, keep questioning, keep making the conversations uncomfortable, because that's how we all grow. We grow when we are uncomfortable. We grow when we've been challenged. We grow when we've been able to sort of understand and feel the emotion, the pain, the hurt, the suffering, and the struggling that certain populations have endured and are still enduring. So my hope is that we will get better because we've always gotten better. The fact that we are able to engage in these conversations, and I'm looking at just this screen before us to see, you know, the kind of the representation of folks who historically would not have been able to be at these institutions, raising the kinds of questions, doing the kind of research, engaging in the kind of scholarship, because there were folks who fought, folks who struggled, folks who pushed and prodded, who are those angelic troublemakers. So my sense of hope is that we have to be angelic troublemakers. We have to be willing to see and envision a different way, a different reality, a new set of possibilities. We have to be hopeful in this work that somehow we can create the kind of world that we know is possible. And that is what sort of gives me hope and optimism, because I know that there were folks who came before me who saw far more challenges than I see today. And my goal is to see, can I create a world in which my children and their children's children have far fewer obstacles in their way because I've done the work that helped to remove some of them. So that's my hope.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. That's a beautiful sentiment, I think, to end on. I just, from our whole School of Education community, we really appreciate you and spending the time with us, and very inspiring. There's lots of more questions for you in the Q&A, and we can in the chat, and we can download those. And I encourage those of you in the audience to reach out and connect, and maybe you can get some more conversations going. But yeah, a huge thank you again for your time, and this was wonderful.
Thank you for having me. Always appreciate coming and talk to my folks from the great UCI.
That's that.
That's that.
All right, see you, everybody. Thank you.